Hello, and welcome to The Complete History of Science, Series 6, Episode 4, Fallopio and Fabricius. By the mid-16th century, an anatomical revolution was underway in Padua. The trailblazer of this upheaval, Andreas Vesalius, wrote a book called the Fabrica, which placed observation of the human body at the centre of the practice of anatomy. The Fabrica was read widely, and its success ensured that dissection would always trump the authority of ancient texts. When Vesalius stepped back from research, his work was continued by his student Colombo. Whereas Vesalius was primarily interested in human anatomy, Colombo, in some respects, surpassed Vesalius, investigating not just the form, but also the function of the human body. This led Colombo to the first major new discovery of the period, the pulmonary circulation of the blood. These pioneers inspired a new generation of students with a healthy skepticism of academic authority. Men who had never met Vesalius or Colombo carried on their legacy. Of these, perhaps the most important and influential were Gabriel Fallopio and Hieronymus Fabricius. Fallopio, the older of the two, was born around 1522 in Modena in Italy. There are no definitive sources on his early life, but we know enough to give a rough sketch. As a youth, he received a classical education, learning both Greek and Latin. Unfortunately, his father, a soldier, died while Fallopio was young. He was saved by the care of an uncle, who, in a story reminiscent of Copernicus, helped Fallopio win a canonary position within the church. Unlike Copernicus, though, Fallopio didn't maintain this position for life, relinquishing it early to turn his attention to the practice of medicine. He began to work as a surgeon in Modena. Some historical records claim he was self-taught, though this is unlikely. While it's true there was no university in Modena, Fallopio probably apprenticed with a local physician or surgeon. His background in surgery prepared him for his future career as an anatomist, and already, by 1544, there's a record of Fallopio performing a public dissection. A contemporary recorded that he dared to dissect a body publicly in Modena, and he showed better than others what is usually shown. Sometime in the 1540s, he moved from Modena to Ferrara, a city which did have a major university. Fallopio was allowed to study medicine, benefiting from the fact that the Italian universities, unlike those in the north, did not require an undergraduate degree to enter. He was also fortunate that surgery was treated seriously in Italy. North of the Alps, surgery was considered a practical pursuit, whereas at Ferrara it was a topic for academic study. The leading practitioner of surgery there was a man called Giovanni Canano, a contemporary of Vesalius. In 1541, Canano had published his own anatomical work, Musculorum Humani, describing the body's muscles with detailed illustrations. Further volumes of this work were planned, but were unpublished, and he may have been dissuaded by the enormous success of the Fabrica, which covered the muscles in great detail. Another of Fallopio's teachers was Antonio Brassavola, one of the most well-known physicians in all of Europe at the time. Ferrara then, though perhaps lacking the prestige of Bologna or Padua, was a solid choice, and Fallopio would have been exposed to the latest ideas in anatomy. By 1544, he was teaching there himself, assisting Canano in his dissections, and by 1546 had acquired an official lectureship. By 1544, he was teaching there himself, assisting Canano in his dissections, and by 1546 had acquired an official lectureship. He had not yet received his doctorate, but this didn't hold him back, and in 1548 he received an invitation from Cosimo de' Medici to move to Pisa, taking up the chair left vacant by Colombo. As part of his offer to move to Pisa, he was promised a supply of corpses for dissection. Despite this pledge, on arrival, he was displeased. He complained that the bodies he was given were already in a state of decay and did not last long enough for him to perform his research. He wrote to the Duke's secretary, begging for at least one healthy body. But, as conditions failed to improve, he departed Pisa. In 1551, he accepted a position at the University of Padua as a lecturer in surgery. Colombo and Vesalius had long since left the university, but their legacy remained, and Fallopio received a good supply of corpses for his research. It was no coincidence, then, that it was here that he would achieve his greatest success. His discoveries during this period are both numerous and original. One of the most important was the description he gave of the barrier, formed of folds of skin, between the large and small intestine. Fallopio suspected that these folds functioned as a valve, but notably, rather than simply assume the truth of this hypothesis, he devised an experiment to test it. Fallopio poured water into the small intestine and saw that it flowed down through the rectum. But when he tried this in reverse, pouring water into the rectum, he discovered that the water would not pass. He deduced that this valve was important for allowing digestive pulp to flow downwards, while preventing fecal matter from flowing back. We now know this as the ileocacal valve, and though its discovery is usually credited to later anatomists, Fallopio was undoubtedly the first. This was not the only discovery that he failed to get credit for. His report on the lacteals, a system of lymphatic vessels near the liver, was the first detailed description of them. He writes that they contained a white fatty substance, which according to Fallopio tasted bland. In his notes, he traces the passage of these vessels from the liver to the pancreas. Unfortunately, Fallopio's discovery was forgotten, and the lacteals were rediscovered by a later anatomist, Azelli. Part of the reason that Fallopio's work in these areas was forgotten was that he didn't include them in his published work. We know of them only through notes left by Fallopio and his students. Fallopio only published one major work during his lifetime, a book known as the Observationes Anatomicae. Written as an epistle addressed to the physician Pietro Manna, the book is neither intended as an introductory work nor a systematic overview, but instead includes Fallopio's most important discoveries, including his research into the female reproductive system. There had, prior to this time, been a fair degree of sexism inherent in anatomy. Aristotle had envisaged the female as an inferior copy of the male. His followers, including Galen, considered the female reproductive system analogous to the male, but turned inside out. The vagina was an inverted penis. The ovaries were internal testes, and the uterus was a scrotum turned inwards. Galen also believed that there was female semen, which was carried from the ovaries to the uterus, equivalent to the male seminal ducts. These ideas had persisted through to Vesalius, who had not updated from Galen. Partially, this inertia was due to practical issues. Most dissections were of criminals, and most criminals were male. Vesalius and other anatomists only had very limited access to female bodies. Fallopio was able to remedy this situation, as he was provided with sufficient female corpses that he could make a detailed examination. He first looked for evidence for this female semen, which was supposed to reside in the ovaries, but he found none. Instead, he discovered that the ovaries contained turgid structures filled with yellowy fluid. He recognized that the ovaries were connected to the uterus through a pair of symmetrical tubes. Today, these tubes bear his name, the fallopian tubes. Historically, Fallopio has sometimes been credited with the discovery of the clitoris. But, by his own admission, this was untrue, and he himself points to the description of it given by both Ibn Sina and al-Sarawi. Nevertheless, he realized that it was missing from Galen and Vesalius, and so gives his own account of the clitoris, which he calls a bifurcation joined at the tip. He also recognized its function. This was important for reasons which went beyond simple scientific curiosity. It implied that God had given women an organ dedicated to female sexual pleasure. The impact of the publication of the Observationes was significant amongst the new community of anatomists. Despite the fact that the Observationes were ostensibly addressed to Pietro Manna, it's clear the real target of the treatise was Vesalius. Fallopio was on the side of Vesalius against Galen, but like Columbo, he recognized that the Fabrica was fallible. Fallopio, following Columbo's lead, pointed out that many of the descriptions in the Fabrica were based on animal rather than human anatomy. For example, in humans, there are 6 muscles, which allow the eye to move up and down, side to side, and in a circle. Vesalius, though, had written of a 7th muscle. Fallopio demonstrated that this 7th muscle can only be found in animals, and criticized the Fabrica, which contained fake visual evidence of the muscle. Fallopio never attacked Vesalius personally, and didn't seek an open confrontation, but it was perhaps inevitable that Vesalius would respond. Vesalius had spent the last 2 decades as a court physician, first to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles, and then to his son Philip, King of Spain. But he'd long been unsatisfied with this life, and in particular his move to the Spanish court. Spain was at this time a backwater. In the late 15th century, the last of the Arabs were driven from Spain, and the Jews were forced to convert or face expulsion. This religious conservatism transferred to the intellectual world, and in medicine, ancient authority still reigned. Some medical schools in Spain even continued to have chairs in astrology. Vesalius was unable to dissect bodies at all, and his research during this period was non-existent. Nevertheless, on hearing Fallopio's criticism in the Observationes, he leapt into action. He responded to the criticism with his own work, the Examen, published in Venice and addressed directly to Fallopio. Although this response was extensive, in reality it said little new, perhaps unsurprising given that Vesalius was unable to conduct any new research. Fallopio, as it transpired, never read the work. In October 1562, he died in Padua, not yet 40 years old. Vesalius heard about the death while on a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Immediately, he rushed back to Italy, probably hoping that this was his opportunity to win back his old role in Padua. In his haste, he boarded a smaller pilgrim ship, rather than wait for passage on the larger Venetian ones. This decision was to be his doom. The small boat soon encountered a violent storm, and for more than 30 days it was battered by the wind and waves. Supplies dwindled, and the passengers' health suffered. During a break in the storm, the ship was finally able to dock at Zante, where Vesalius was brought ashore, sick and broken. he would never return aboard, and died on the island where he was buried. He had outlived both Columbo and Fallopio, but was still young, just shy of 50 years old. The chair that Vesalius had sought in Padua remained unoccupied until 1565, when it was given to another man. Hieronymus Fabricius was just 32 years old and a student of Fallopio. He had recently been awarded his doctorate and for some time had been teaching privately in Padua. Upon his appointment at the university, he would continue the program initiated by his illustrious predecessors, performing dissections and collecting research. Unlike them, however, he was often called out as a poor teacher. He would miss lectures frequently or teach the entirely wrong topic. Nevertheless, he maintained his position, received an ever-growing salary, and, in 1594, oversaw the construction of a huge new, purpose-built anatomy theatre. He remained in his position until 1619, when he died at the age of 86. During his time as chair of anatomy, Fabricius made some of the first studies of comparative anatomy between humans and animals. Specifically, he made careful study of similar organs in different animals to attempt to better study their general purpose. So, for example, rather than simply look at the eye in humans, he compared the eyes of different animals to try and find similarities between their functions. In this regard, he considered himself a follower of Aristotle, who likewise sought to provide a general, universal account rather than one specific to a given animal. In the case of the eye, for example, he concluded that the crystalline humour was consistent across animals and therefore a key part of vision. Fabricius was critical of Vesalius for only attempting to describe the body without necessarily advancing an understanding of its functions. His ideas, then, closely resembled Columbo, but above all, it was Aristotle that Fabricius admired. His approach to anatomy was philosophical, and like Aristotle, he was above all interested in causes. Crucially, however, unlike in an earlier age where Aristotle was seen as the head of a complete philosophical system, Fabricius explicitly calls Aristotle's project unfinished and sees his own role as continuing Aristotle's work. This approach was applied throughout his long career, but we can illustrate it by examining his best-known work. During his dissections, Fabricius noted the presence of flaps in the veins. He called these flaps osteola, which translates as little doors. He certainly wasn't the first to observe the osteola, which had already been recorded by Giovanni Canano in Ferrara and Jacob Silvius in Paris. Probably the first to observe them was a man called Charles Estienne, who mentioned some excrescences in the hepatic veins. Fabricius gives a very detailed account of the osteola, which he works into his broader program. With Aristotle in mind, Fabricius sets out to understand the function of these valves. He notes that these valves existed in the veins, but not the arteries. This was unexpected, as Galen had proposed that the arterial and venous systems had very similar functions. Fabricius then needed to understand why the veins contained the osteola, but the arteries didn't. He proceeded from his understanding, derived from Galen, that though both the veins and arteries distributed blood, there were two different types. In the arteries, there was vital blood, which mixed with air in the lungs and was responsible for distributing vital spirit around the body. On the other hand, in the veins, there was nutritive blood, which came from the liver and provided nutrition to the body. Fabricius concluded that the osteola were necessary in order to assist with the absorption of nutrition in the veins. He deduced that the valves slow down the blood, which gives it more time to be absorbed. This theory fit with his understanding of the rest of the body. He observed that the osteola were usually present in the limbs. This was, according to him, because the motion of the limbs created a large amount of heat in these areas. Following the Galenic tradition, he believed that this would cause more blood to be drawn quickly to the heat, and hence leave other areas without sufficient blood. The osteola's function was to slow down this flow of blood, ensuring it was properly distributed. His work on the osteola was far from the only achievement in Fabricius's long career. He performed extensive dissections, examining the body's organs. His work on the development of the fetus is especially notable, and he made several comparative studies of reproduction between humans and other animals. However, it's his work on the osteola which would be his most important legacy, and this was for one very specific historical reason. His lectures were witnessed by a young Englishman called William Harvey. We'll return to Harvey next time. In a future series, I also hope we'll continue the story of the development of anatomy into the 17th century. Fabricius would not be the last great anatomist to work in Padua, and Italy would continue to lead the world in the field for some time. As for today though, goodbye. Until next time.